Today I'm going to talk about some of the amazing types of discoveries that you can make in old books. Not all of them are very obvious, but these are the type of things, some of the type of things that book dealers look for, that we dream about, and we are very excited when we find. So if you're a collector or getting into the rare book business, these are the type of things, and some examples I'll show you of what you can discover in old books. The first example goes under the category of ownership or provenance. It is a copy printed in 1553 by Conrad Gesner. Gesner was a famous 16th century Swiss natural historian and physician, and he wrote one of the great Renaissance encyclopedic texts on animals. And this particular book is filled with splendid woodcuts of animals and some not so splendid. What is fascinating about this particular copy is on page 127 in the upper right margin is an ownership inscription. So those are the type of things you want to look for. However, when I first read this, it was in a very florid script and I couldn't make it out. After studying it for a little while, I realized it was in mirror writing. So whoever did this, like the way Leonardo da Vinci would write his secret code, wrote his name in the mirror. And it says, when you hold it up to a mirror, George Pinkeroff, his book. So a very unusual ownership inscription, not in the beginning of the book where you would normally find one, but just on the margin of the page by going through it carefully. So that is example number one. Example number two. Okay, that's a heavy one. This goes under the category of binder's waste. The book itself is the Natural History by Plinius, one of the largest and most important encyclopedic texts that has come down to us from the ancient world. It's printed by Froben, a friend of Erasmus, in 1554. But what is fascinating about this book is the binder's waste. Many times in old books, in the construction of the bindings, either on the paste downs or the end papers, or even to pad the spine, book binders used old scraps of manuscripts lying around. Today, they're very exciting to discover, and it is a very hot field because you can find what used to be trash in the medieval or Renaissance period turns out to be a lost text of which there's no other known copies. So everybody is always looking for those scraps in the binding. What is particularly unusual about this copy, however, is it doesn't have those waste paste downs. So why am I talking about it? Because this is a very bizarre example of what I can only call a ghost binder's waste. Once upon a time, there must have been an old manuscript used as the paste downs in both boards here, because the ink has seeped through to the boards, and you can see the ghost of what was once binder's waste in the book. So I find that very unusual. It's the only time actually I've ever seen that. So that goes on the category of binder's waste. Next example, Bookplates. I don't think there is anything quite the equivalent outside of the book world in terms of bookplates, the amount of information about the ownership that you can learn from a simple bookplate. This book is the Relics of Rome, printed in 1563. I actually just bought it on Instagram the other day, so you can always scroll through Instagram and find interesting things. So I'll give a shout out to raretome.com. Isaiah, thank you. What is interesting about this particular copy is it has the bookplate of Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas was a very famous American publisher. He was actually the first person to publicly read the Declaration of Independence, the first person to report on the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and a founder of the American Antiquarian Society. Even more interesting is that his bookplate was engraved for him by Paul Revere, the great patriot. So when Paul Revere was not lining the streets with lights to warn the Minutemen against the impending British troops, he was a silversmith and an engraver, and he did bookplates. So this is the second bookplate he did for Isaiah Thomas. So it's really wonderful that these two great names in American history are linked in a single bookplate and ownership of a copy. Why Isaiah Thomas wanted to own a 16th century book by Thomas Deacon on Rome, it's actually a railed against some of the Catholic practices in England at the time, comparing them to the Antichrist. A lot of things are always compared to the Antichrist, I guess. But I would suppose the book is actually printed by John Day. John Day was one of the most famous printers in the English Reformation. He famously printed Fox's Book of Martyrs. And besides his skill at printing, he was well known for his business acumen. So you could understand that perhaps Isaiah Thomas felt a sort of kindred spirit across the centuries with John Day, since they were both printers and businessmen. So always look at the bookplates. Example number 4. This goes under the category of annotations. The book is Basilius Magnus, printed in 1512. What's interesting about one of the things that's interesting about the book is it's printed by Jacob Thanner. The printer was also responsible for the 95 Theses of Martin Luther, that famous broadside that was pinned to a church door in Wittenberg in Germany and really lit the flame of the Reformation. So it is the same printer for the book. If that is not wonderful enough, what I want to talk about, however, is what makes this copy unique. And on the last page here are 2 pages of annotations in an early hand. Booksellers are always looking for annotations for evidence of ownership and using a book and how they were read. The manuscript is actually a 2-page poem by Heinrich Bebel, who was a German humanist of the period. And it is a poem for a student reminding him of the vanities of life. We can always be reminded of the vanities to keep things in perspective. I love things to do with the vanities, whether it's Savonarola and the Bonfire of the Vanities, up to Tom Wolfe's quintessential 1980s book, or all of those paintings of the vanitas that you see with skulls reminding us of how short life is. So a very interesting contemporary poem in a copy of the book. So always look for any manuscript annotations in that book. Book number 5, I think that's what we're up to. This is an late 18th century American children's book, The History of Master Jackie and Miss Harriet for the Improvement of the Mind. We could always use some improvement, all of us. Dedicated to the good children of the United States of America. So very early on. And children's books of the period can be very rare. As you can imagine, they were tossed aside and read and destroyed. So very few of them survive. Besides being a rare book of the period, what is wonderful about this is the doodle. I always look for pen doodles in books. I find them fascinating and charming, and I really relate to, or at least I imagine, a child holding this book in their hand and just doodling freely with a pen. And these are quite charming. I don't know what they are, a seal or something. But there's a certain intimacy and connection you feel with the book when there are interesting doodles. So always look for doodles in a book. Moving on to a nice, dusty old volume. Paste downs, I'll put that in this category. The book itself is The Gentleman's Recreation in 1686, and it covers everything you could imagine a gentleman of the period would want to do, from horsemanship to fortification, navigation, etc. What is unusual about this copy is the paste down. Sometimes in books they have fabulous things that have nothing to do with the book that are pasted to the inner boards. This particular one has a full-color broadside poem called An Account of James Hurst, Esquire. James Hurst was one of the most famous eccentrics of the 18th century in England. He went around in a colored wicker carriage pulled by a bull that rang a bell every kilometer, and he had a large, broad brimmed hat. He was so eccentric that King George III invited to see him, and the first time he refused, he just sent him a letter telling him he was teaching otters to fish, so he had no time for the king. Eventually, he did meet him. His house was filled to the brim with all sorts of knickknacks and iron fillings, sort of like a modern-day hoarder. And I'm sure American pickers or somebody would have loved to have gone through that particular house. So always look at the inner boards, and sometimes you can find interesting paste downs. And again, I recommend that great group on Facebook of Simon Beatty, We Love End Papers, so you can see some other decorated end papers there. And finally, what did I do with that? It's over here, A Book of Nothing. So I guess the equivalent of Seinfeld in the book world, but this is actually a book of nothing. What it is circa 1800 book, but it's been made into a secret book safe. They often did that with a lot of late 18th century, 19th century books when you wanted to hide jewels or money or something important and just put it on the shelf, and it looks like an ordinary volume. So I like old book safes. This particular one, going back to the book plate, was owned by Hugo William Kohler. He was a Russian spy. He worked for the Americans, and purportedly he was able to get some of the Romanovs out of Russia during the revolution. So I sort of imagine perhaps that he hid some interesting things in this book at one time. We'll have to leave that to the imagination. But a secret bookcase, a book of nothing. So those are some of the fabulous types of things that you can find in old books. I encourage you, they're only some of the things, and I encourage you to look through every old book carefully and try and make discoveries. And I hope you'll tune in for other episodes and other secrets of the antiquarian book business, and please subscribe.